Hello everyone, my name is Jerome Loisel and I'm here to talk about practical approaches to active learning and peer learning. This is a talk that I gave on active learning 2 weeks ago at the Rascals 2016 conference. Rascals is the ESL conference for Quebec college teachers. This is my name, Jerome Loisel. This is my email address in case you have any questions or comments. And I did want to mention that the images I use, I did not create myself. They're mostly from Google Images. They're used here in accordance with fair dealing provisions. We have the right to do this in case you did not know. What are our goals for today? It is important to have clear goals, as Ned Stark learned in season 1 of Game of Thrones. Really important to have clear goals. So, goals for today. Our goals is to talk about active learning. What is it? Why do we use it? And what is the rationale for using it? Then we're going to go over specific examples of active learning to decide who should use it, who it should be used for, how it should be used, and what it should be used for. A little introduction about me. I'm a college level teacher. I teach mainly ESL, and right now I have two categories of students. I have Formation Générale students who are taking a mandatory English course in level 101 and who therefore are not extremely motivated by the prospect of learning English. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Hermione Granger here, who represents the very motivated students. I also have language students. These are students who are enrolled in the language program, and so when they see me for their English civilization course, that's the course that they have with me, they're actually keeners. They're motivated. They're happy to be there. They want to learn English, Spanish, German. Their languages. That's why they're there. This has a lot of impact on what you do in active learning, so it's useful to think of my two student populations, my unmotivated English 101 students and my very motivated English civilization students. And perhaps you can make parallels with your own student populations. If you have a mandatory course with not very motivated students, then you can do the types of activities that I do with my 101 level students. If you have a higher level course, pre-university course, something like that where students are more motivated, more internally motivated, then you can do what I do with my civilization students or use that as ideas as starting points. What is active learning is the next question. Active learning is like the girl on the right. She is learning to play the guitar, not by being told how to play the guitar, but by playing the guitar. Active learning is when you do the learning yourself by practicing, pretending you're doing something, discussing, etc. What is the opposite of active learning? What's called passive learning, and it's what you see on the left. It's a lecture, a very traditional university lecture with university students sitting there and just taking notes, not engaged in any discussions or doing anything. They're just listening to the teacher. So that's a stereotype of what active learning and passive learning are. Another simplistic example, imagine that you give your students some reading homework. What do you do with the reading homework once it is done? Do you stand in front of the class and give the answers to the reading homework? This is called passive learning, and you can see by the body postures of the students that, they're kind of passive. On the right, we have the same homework, but instead of the teacher giving the answers, the students have to get together and do a discussion about it, find the answers, that kind of thing. And this is an example of active learning. Now, there are misconceptions about active learning, and part of this talk is about those misconceptions. So I want to go over them very quickly. First of all, the first misconception is that active learning is new. So it's very popular right now, and so that leads some people to believe that active learning is a new thing. It is not a new thing, as we can understand if we think about the example of the music lesson. Music lessons have been around for hundreds of years, and so at least the practice of active learning has been around for hundreds of years. The theory of active learning is also not quite new. The seminal articles were written mostly in the 90s. And since then, there's been a lot of research, like studies where they do statistical comparisons between active learning groups and passive learning groups to try to determine the effectiveness of active learning. But basically, it's not new. It's been around for at least 25 years in its theory. Second misconception is that active learning is good for all subjects, and I don't think it is. I think the effectiveness of active learning will vary a lot on what you're teaching, and so this is what I'm going to go over in this talk. Next misconception that it's active learning is good for all students and for all teachers, like that all students should do active learning for and all teachers should do active learning. I don't think it's true. I think if we think of my 101 level students and my civilization students, we're going to see differences in how active learning should be used. Also, there are differences based on the teachers. Finally, there's the misconception that whether you're doing active learning or passive learning depends on what you're having your students do, and that's the only thing that matters to decide if you're doing active learning or not. For example, if the students are doing it this, by discussion, it's active. If you're talking, it's passive. So, and this is always the case. And I don't think that this is true. So let's go over why these things are not true. So what is the goal of active learning? The goal of active learning is to have the student engaged, mentally engaged, active, involved in what is going on. The reason why we do this is because studies have shown that as somebody who cares about the subject, is involved, is active, is engaged, will remember more what is happening than a student who is not engaged, who doesn't care, etc., etc., etc. And this is why we do active learning, to get the brain engaged and active. And so this leads me to the conclusion that active learning is actually not as binary as it first seems. The girl on the right officially is doing active learning, and the students on the left are officially doing passive learning. But I think we can all agree that it is quite possible for the girl on the right to be extremely motivated and engaged and active. It is also possible that the girl on the right is not motivated and is not active and is not engaged. She's there because her parents are forcing her to be there. She doesn't care. She refuses to learn the guitar. She's just going to sit there for an hour every week until the semester is over, and she will not learn anything. And as a contrast, on the left, we have university students, and this is really a classical example of passive learning, very criticized today. A lot of people say things like you can only pay attention for 10 minutes, and so everything after the first 10 minutes it disappears, vanishes out. And this is strange because all of the people who say this are researchers and university graduates, etc. And all of us researchers and university graduates have fond memories of sitting in those classrooms and taking notes, and page after page after page of notes of the teacher talking for hours, and then we get to the end of the day and we're completely burned out intellectually because of how much effort it took to write all of this down and to stay focused for 3 hours, because it is not natural. It's not natural to stay focused for 3 hours, but all of us has done it at some point in one class. It was particularly interesting to us. It's out, and it was extremely painful, but it was good pain. It's the same pain as people who go to the gym and then show you later on, look, I can't even move my arm anymore. They're all happy about how much the arm hurts now. It's a sign that they worked very hard and very well, and that they're building their muscles and that kind of thing. And we felt the same way about our focused attention during those lectures. And we were like, oh, that's so painful, but it's good. I learned so much. And so it is quite possible to be in a lecture hall and to have our brain be really active and engaged. That does not mean that the photo on the left is active or that the photo on the right is passive. I'm just saying there are gradients, there are degrees, and the specifics of the situation really matter. And so that's what we're going to go over today. First, let's look a little bit of theory. I'm just going to spend a few minutes on this. This is a very basic literature review that I mostly got from Wikipedia. And the reason I use Wikipedia is good for fields that are well established, 10, 20, 30 years old, and on which there has been a lot of research, and they just like summarize the research that exists. It's not good for very fringe subjects on which there isn't a lot of research, and very contemporary subjects where the research is very new. And since active learning is not new, Wikipedia is actually a really good starting point to get some information about what it is, how it's supposed to work, does it work, the results, research, that kind of stuff. And so I went to Wikipedia. Here are some things I found on Wikipedia. First of all, there's this diagram, which I think he really helps to understand why we're doing this. It's called the Learning Retention Pyramid, and it's based on Bloom's taxonomy. And you've got three different types of tasks, and they're graded in terms of how much the student remembers from their lesson if their lesson is by doing this task. So the first example at the bottom in red is receiving information. So this is a lecture. The student is watching an audiovisual document, a video, he's reading, or he's sitting in a lecture. How much does the student remember from that experience? It's considered to be under 20%. Now, if the student at the opposite end in blue is learning by doing, this is the girl playing the guitar. You could also imagine somebody in a chemistry lab training to be a chemist, and he's actually working with the machines doing a real experiment and so on. So he's learning by doing. So it's to work with a coach, immediate practicing, that kind of thing. What is in the middle? In the middle is like when you're imitating life, but it's not really life. So you're pretending to use a machine in a chemistry lab, but the machine is off. You're doing discussions about how the machine should be used, that kind of thing. So play, exercises, discussions, demonstration. And for this, the expected, how much the student is expected to remember from this is 20 to 75%. Again, it can vary greatly, but this is what we generally expect. Next, some principles of active learning. This is by a researcher called Douglas Barnes. Now, so I'm just going to go through these very quickly and then explain what the basic idea is. So he put forward 7 principles of active learning, and these are to determine whether or not a specific task is active learning. This is really useful in research because they want to do an active learning classroom, compare that with a passive learning classroom, and they want to be sure that their research is really very accurate. So they want to have specific criteria so that they can tell you whether your thing is active or whether it's passive. And after that, they can measure it. So this is why they have these very specific criteria. This does not mean that if you want to do active learning, you have to do all of this. But these are just like the best practices, the guidelines accepted for research, that kind of thing. So to qualify as active learning, the activity has to have purpose, to reflect the students' concerns, their pre-existing concerns. The guy who wants to become a chemist and is learning chemistry, not what you think should be important for them. For example, remembering their final S. If you have to explain why this is important, then you're not respecting this criteria. Next has to be reflective. Students have to reflect on the meaning of what they learned. Negotiated, the goals and methods. So how the student learns has to be negotiated. This means there has to be back and forth between the student and the teacher and the methods that are being used, or other students, like how do we learn this? What is the best way of doing this? And perhaps the way that they do it is different from the way that you expected them to do it. Critical, this is kind of the same thing, appreciating different ways of learning. So the student can think of different ways of learning it and can be critical about them and what he prefers, he or she prefers. Complex, a task to be active has to be complex. It has to reflect the complexities that exist in real life because you're trying to have an active, engaged brain. It's really difficult to have an active, engaged brain if you're doing something too simple. I mean, you're going to be bored. It has to be situation driven. So you have to create a situation in class that is similar to a real life situation. For example, the girl in the guitar lesson, she's trying to learn to play the guitar. So what she's doing in her lesson is exactly like if she were in real life with her family at a Christmas party trying to play the guitar. The guy in the chemistry experiment, he's trying to, he's imitating what his real life will be like. And finally, engaged. It has to be based on real life tasks. Oh, right. So I mixed up 6 and 7. So it has to be engaged based on real life tasks, and what they do has to be dictated by this situation that you're trying to imitate. Now, does this apply to ESL? I think you're going to notice right away that not all of this applies to ESL. For example, I gave the example of a final S trying to do negatives. Can you do a real life task that is complex, that is based on doing the negatives correctly, that the students immediately care about, that kind of thing? It's probably extremely difficult. So that's why I'm saying we don't need to look at these as uh, minimum criteria. We need to look at this as the ideal criteria, the best practices, etc. And they will help us understanding this, what is being said here, will help us understand why sometimes some activities succeed and others fail. So that's why it's good to see this. All right, so what is the scientific consensus on active learning? The scientific consensus is that it is good, that it works. So you've got all these criteria for determining whether something is active learning or not. And when you do research based on these criteria, you find that it works, it improves. It's not 50% improvement. It's 5, 10, 15, 20% improvement, depending on the task, depending on the students, depending on what you're trying to measure in terms of percentage of improvement. But it does work fairly well. And if you want to know more about all this, you can go to Wikipedia. It's really a good starting point, including if you want lists of activities, active learning. Obviously, I'm going to see some, but if you want like lists of activities and guidelines for what an activity could be, Wikipedia is a good starting point. Try to remember the goal. We've seen all the criteria, but the goal, the active engaged brain, this is what matters the most. This is, as a pedagogue, this is what you want. You're not trying to do research. You're not trying to decide if something fits the definition of active learning or not. You're trying to accomplish the goal. The goal is the active engaged brain. So that's how we're going to evaluate our activities in today's talk. Does the activity succeed at engaging, having an active engaged brain or not? Now we get to those specific activities. I'm going to tell you the activity that I attempted. I'm going to tell you how well it worked. Did it work very well? Did it not work at all? And I'm going to tell you what lessons I learned from all of this. First activity is the vocabulary sheet. All right. So I give this sheet to my 101 level students, and I have them work on it in teams, and they can use their phones to find the definitions. At the top, you see you have the list of words that they're supposed to learn. At the bottom, you see they have the French equivalent. So they use their phones, they use each other, they're in teams, and they have to like find the equivalent. This will become quiz material eventually, as you can see on at the top of the page. And so they have to find the answers. Um, Also, I made an effort to make this list fun and engaging. It reflects, it doesn't, it's not a tip, it's a list about personality traits, but it's not your typical list about personality traits. Very often those lists are based on like, it seems like they're based on fantasy stories. They have a lot of heroic sounding words to describe personality. Somebody is modest and thoughtful and open-minded and courageous and like that kind of thing. You often have words derived from Latin in there, and they really don't reflect students' lives very much. I mean, when do you really say that somebody is courageous? One of your classmates. I mean, it can happen in extreme cases, but mostly you're not talking about how courageous they are. You're talking about how annoying they are because they're so clingy. And so these words, you've got words here like bossy and clingy and horny and flirty and that kind of thing, which are really not very often in student lists and which make this list, I guess, more fun and engaging. When we do this activity, I hear a lot of snickering about the words and they seem happy to know these words. Now, what makes this active learning? What makes this active learning is that I do not give the answers. The students have to find the answers on their own. There is never a point where I hand out a sheet and it has the official answers. There is never a point where I stand in front of the class and I tell them what the answers were. What they can do if they finish the list during the class, which they're supposed to do, they can show it to me and I will tell them if it's good or not good. And if it's not good, I might tell them something like number 7, 11, 21, and 24 are not good. Like that's as far as I will go. If a student asks me, what is entité? I don't remember what entité is. I don't tell them. They have to find it on their own. So this is what makes this an active learning list. And I want to say that this is a very old-fashioned activity. I know this. And I'm not telling you, and what is really innovative right now in terms of, what is really fashionable right now in terms of learning vocabulary is learning vocabulary by doing games, interactive activities, reusing the vocabulary in compositions and discussions, that kind of thing. And I'm not telling you to not do activities like this. If you want to learn your students to learn vocabulary, yes, 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 they must go beyond a vocabulary list. They must do games. They must reuse the vocabulary. If they only see it once in the vocabulary list, they're probably not going to learn much vocabulary. So I'm not telling you to replace those activities. I'm just saying before you do activities like a game based on a vocabulary list, you're probably going to use a vocabulary list. You're probably going to give them a list. And my question is, what if you make this list active, like I just described? Does this work or does this not work? So I tried it with my 101 students, not very motivated students, and I can tell you, yes, it works. It's a pretty good activity. B is a solid activity that I would redo. I'm not telling, it's not an A in the sense that I'm not telling you you have to do this. It's the most amazing way to learn English ever. It's just a vocabulary list, but it's a good way to do vocabulary lists. And if I do vocabulary lists, I prefer to do them this way. So how do I know that this is a good activity? Well, two things. First of all, when we do the activity, I have decent participation. Even though we're doing vocabulary, I see my students are engaged in the task. They're actually doing the task. They don't just start talking about other things. They really try to finish the list. They seem motivated by the list. And I have some results. Obviously, some students don't learn the vocabulary at all, but doing it this way, as opposed to how I did it before, which was a very passive learning list, has improved the results a little bit in the quiz. I also do, as I mentioned, games and discussions based on the vocabulary tile, but just on the first go, when they get the list, doing it in an active learning way has improved the results somewhat. And the students seem to enjoy it. All right, so what are the lessons learned from this activity? First of all, active learning is a method. This really, really, really matters. Here we have Douglas Adams saying, I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that I don't know the answer. This is something you have to learn to do with your students. If you're going to do active learning, you have to stop answering questions. You really, if you do the same activity, but you say, you know what, my students really need the answers because it's going to be on a quiz someday, so I'm going to make an answer sheet and give it to my students at the end of the class. If you do that and start doing that, the students will start to expect it, and you will see that participation really, really lowers because they're just going to not do it. They're just going to wait for you to give them the answer sheet. With me, they know if they want their list of vocabulary for the quiz, they have to do it themselves. That's the only way they're going to get it. They can ask me all they want. I'm not going to tell them. What is en tête? I don't know. I don't remember. So I see once they understand that I'm not going to give them an answer sheet, participation goes way, way up. So that's the first thing. But also, if you want to do this, there's going to be a lot of different situations where you have to start refusing to answer questions. And this can be extremely difficult as a teacher because, a student is asking us a question. Presumably, they want to know the answer. And if they leave the classroom without knowing the answer, I guess we haven't done our job, right? So this is what I mean by when I say that active learning is a method. You have to learn some methods of not answering questions. It's actually very difficult to not answer questions and do that correctly. When a student asks you a question, he wants to know two things. He wants to know what the answer is, and he wants to be sure that he knows what the answer is. Those are two different things. For example, you have some students saying, okay, what's the word here? Because they don't know. So they want to know the answer. You have other students who point at a word and say, is this right? Is this good? And it is. It usually is. When they ask the question like this, they know it's good. They just want to be sure. So those are two different questions. And the way you approach those questions is different. So you're going to have to learn tips so that you don't just answer the question. You don't just refuse to answer the question, but you point them in the right direction so that they can find the answer on their own. Let's take an example from the vocabulary list. A student shows me a word on the English list for, let's say, clothing, and then they show me panties. Like, what is panties? I'm not going to tell them. So what do? What I do, well, one for vocabularists, a very, very useful tool since they all have phones, is to tell them to use Google and specifically Google Images. So I say, all right, here's what you do. Take your phone, go on Google, but not normal Google. Go on Google Images, write panties, and I'm going to continue walking to see the other teams. But if it's not clear, you raise your hand and I'll come back and I'll explain to you. They never raise their hand. So for vocabulary lists where something can be seen, Google Images will be amazing, and it's incredible just how often in an active learning classroom, just telling the students to go to Google Images, how often that works. So that's one resource. But you're going to have to learn a lot of tips like this so that the student is asking you the question, you don't answer the question, but you point them in a way where they will have the answer and they will be certain that they have the answer. And that's going to be extremely empowering for the student because they're not only going to learn the answer, they're going to learn how to find the answer. Their own certainty will come from them from within, not from you, which is wonderful, which is one of the major goals of active learning. So becoming really good at this, it matters. Next lesson from this very simple vocabulary list, which you can see is there's a lot going on. Content matters. Now, if you remember our goal is the active, engaged brain. If your vocabulary list is extremely traditional and boring and all about honor and honesty and I don't know, self something and preparedness and whatever, witty and all that stuff. If those are your words, your students are just not going to be very engaged. They're engaged in my lists specifically because I make them about teenage life. There's some sexy words in there. There's some insults in there. The list on clothing includes underwear and kind of sexy stuff. So I try to make my list really fun and engaging. And you have to do this. It's not just about I'm not giving them the answer, therefore it's active. It's also about they're engaged, therefore it's active. And for them to be engaged, they have to care about the quality of what is being presented to them. So every little detail in your list matters. The content, the quality of your content really matters. So expect to spend a lot of time working on the quality of your material. Lesson number three: points matter. I wish we could explain to our students that points actually don't matter. They're not what life is made of. Life is not about getting the most points. And very, right now, points kind of matters in their overall academic success, but very soon they'll enter the real world and nobody's going to check their transcripts. And it's not, what is going to matter is how good they are, right? That's what's going to matter. And we wish we could explain that to them. But really, that's not going to work. And it's not active learning. Active learning is about uh, uh, doing activities based on what students care about. And we, as teachers, as schools, as institutions, have created students who care about points. We have created this monster, and now we must feed the monster. The monster wants points. You need to give points to the monster. Uh, my lists work because they will be on a quiz someday. The fact that it counts for almost nothing in a session, if you really take the time to count, the matters less than the fact that it does count, that I can tell them, of course it counts, it's on the quiz. So always take that into account. Yes, make your activity as engaging as you can, but if it doesn't count, it doesn't lead to anything that counts, expect motivation to just crash. And those are my lessons. Next activity, deductive essay structure. So we're going from the most conservative activity that you can imagine, which is just a very straight vocabulary list, to a very kind of out there, innovative activity. What I wanted to do with this activity is I was tired of standing in front of the class for 20, 30 minutes explaining thesis statements and topic sentences and why the background information goes before the thesis and that kind of stuff. And my students, I was tired of that because my students get really bored when I do it, and they mostly don't listen, and then I have to do it again and again and again, and it's a very slow progress. And if they're not engaged, if they're not doing it, why are we still doing it this way? And I thought, is there any way we could do this with peer learning? So where I'm not teaching them, but they're kind of learning it on their own. And I thought of this way. So what I do is I give them two essays. One of them is a bad essay, one of them is a good essay. And I tell them which one the good one is and which one the bad one is. And this actually matters. You can't, you have to, if you want to do an activity like this, it really needs to be very guided. And then I ask them guided questions. I ask them to compare the good essay and the bad essay. I ask them to compare the introductions, for example. I tell them, because in French their introductions go from general to specific, and I ask them which introduction goes from general to specific. And then they figure out, oh, it's the bad one. And then I ask them, what does the other one do instead? And then they have to read it and like, oh, it does this instead. And then I ask them even more pointed questions, like, is there a sentence in this introduction that explains, that summarizes the whole essay? And if so, underline it. I'm like, oh, okay. And then they find out it's the last one. And then in the paragraphs, I ask them the same thing. Is there a sentence in this paragraph that summarizes the entire paragraph? And if so, underline it. And very often, just by reflex, they underline the last sentence because that's where they think you should put a sentence that summarizes the entire paragraph. And then I work with them, and then they realize, oh, it's not the last one. And then they realize it's the first one. Now, what comes next is I give them a list of all the elements that should be in a text: the attention grabber, the background information, the paragraph development, the topic sentences, thesis statement, all that. And they're all in alphabetical order. And it doesn't say like this is the introduction. It just says, okay, this is a part of the text where information about the subject is given in a neutral way, that kind of stuff. And what I ask them is I ask them to find this in the good essay. And then finally, I give them this. This is what an essay plan is supposed to look like. But as you can see in the middle and on the right, the information is incomplete. It doesn't, I can see from here that there's supposed to be three different things in the introduction, but I can't see what they are. So what they have to do is they have to use what they already used, the sheets on the good essay, the bad essay, what the elements of the essay are and where they are. And they have to put that here with the name of the element and the number of sentences. This is called scaffolding. A scaffolding is I give you the basic structure for the information that you're supposed to retain from today's lesson, but you fill in the theory. So you write the theory. Um, with my very guided activity. Um, Right, so this was done in teams. My teams worked on this, and I had a few motivators that I put in there. First of all, obviously this counts. This was done at the beginning of the year. I don't collect this, but I mean, I tell them that this is what their exam is going to be. They're going to have to write essays, and they're going to have to follow this structure. So they need to get the structure. Next, I don't give answers. I do not have an answer sheet for this where the real essay structure is written and explained that I give at the end of class. That would not be active learning anymore. That would be passive learning. And I did this at the end of the class, and I told them, when you're done, you can go because this is the end of the class. So I was like, but do they decide if they're, no, no, no. When they think they're done, they raise their hand and they show me their sheet. And first thing, I make sure that everybody has the same sheet. I don't answer, I don't look at a sheet if different members have different things or if one has an incomplete sheet. I wait for all of them to have a full sheet. And next, they show me their sheet, and I only tell them if it's good or not good. If it's good, they can go. If it's not good, I tell them, no, this is not good. And if they're really lost, the thing about not answering questions is you have to point them in the right direction. I'll tell them, well, your introduction here, that doesn't work. There's something here that doesn't work. So then they have to go back to the good essay and make sure it fits and that kind of stuff. So does this work? Yes, this works extremely well. I think this is a great, great, great activity. I was teaching the essay with one-on-one level students, not civilization students, one-on-one students. And I had engaged, interested students. That does not normally happen. Also, I found that my students learned the essay much faster. It didn't take as long in the year to learn how to write a good essay, and I had better structured essays at the midterm than I did in previous years. So I was really, really happy with this. Why do I put a question mark? Because this does not work for all teachers. I had colleagues who had heard about this method and decided to try it, and it didn't work very well for them. And they made changes to my activity. I believe they answered more questions. I don't remember exactly. I remember they told me about, one thing that they did is that they removed the indication from the essays about which one the good one was and which one the bad one was. So their activity was less guided, and I think they gave the answers at the end. And so it didn't really work for these teachers. So, what are lessons learned from all of this? From my own personal experience and my friend's personal experience. First of all, make sure it fits. Clothes on a rack can look great and then they don't work on you, so you shouldn't buy them. This is the same for activities. This activity is a very advanced active learning activity. It's quite difficult to pull off. You have to be really good at not answering questions. You have to be and guide the students toward the right answer so that they know what the right answer is on their own. And if it's your first attempt at active learning, this is perhaps not the best place to start. So and sometimes an active learning activity works for one teacher, it doesn't work for the other teacher. Um, I think some teachers are better suited for active learning than others. You can sort of divide teaching tasks in like two categories. You've got the creative aspect where you're creating new activity, which some teachers do a lot of, and some teachers almost do none of. And you have the technical pedagogical aspect of you're standing in front of a classroom and you're teaching. Like you're talking, you're teaching. And some people are very good at one of these two and kind of bad at the other or good at both or these are different things. For example, I'm personally somebody who's really good at designing, like the design part, making new activities, whereas the performance aspect, the teaching aspect, I'm okay. I'm not very good. I'm not bad. I'm okay. And so for somebody like me who's much better at designing than performing, active learning is going to work very well because active learning is all about how good your activity is, the little details, the content and all that. And then you're almost doing nothing, right? But passive learning is more about how good you are standing in front of the class and talking, public speaking, and just that. Does that keep your students motivated and engaged and excited about what they're learning, or are you kind of boring? And so for me, I should do more active learning. And I have my colleagues who are really much better, I think, in at the performance aspect than me. Then they don't need it as much. But so think about your teaching strengths, what good you're at. And if you're better at the performance, do more passive. If you're better at the design, do more active. Next activity. Again, based on scaffolding, this is what if we use scaffolding for grammar? This is something I've heard about in recent years. The idea of, all right, let's give them a sheet like the one that I gave them on the essay, but about, let's say, the negatives, or let's say how to do the final S in the third person, or that kind of thing, how to ask questions. And so you would give them guided sheets with examples. And I really did this. For a couple of years, I taught English 101 without using a textbook. I used only my own material. Everything was scaffolding, and they had to write their own textbook, basically. And they had the way it worked is they were in teams, they had guided examples with good negatives, bad negatives, and they had to describe the grammar rules based on these good and bad examples, etc. And then they write them. So, again, really popular idea and that I've tried, and I tried for a couple of years. And how does this work? It does not work, not in my experience. So, by what criteria does this not work? First of all, when the students showed me their work, I found that there were a lot of mistakes. So they would show me a completed sheet. Everybody had the completed sheet. Everybody had finished, and the rule that was explained there was not the right rule. Like if you applied that rule, your negatives would be bad. And then I didn't have much of a recourse because they were done with the activity. So I didn't know how to guide them except tell them, no, this is wrong. What you have to do instead, the rule instead is, and then tell them the rule. And so we kind of reverted back to passive learning for this. And I had very unmotivated students. When they did the activity, they didn't care. Um, so this didn't work well, and I decided not to do this again. What are the lessons learned from this? Well, some are old lessons. For example, content matters. Students cared about my vocabulary list because it was fun, sexy, engaging. They could immediately see why learning words like clingy and bossy was relevant to their lives. And then they used that to talk about people that they knew. I didn't have to tell them, oh, mention people. Like, they really used that. Um, Negatives and final S and all this grammar that we do in college, that this is something that we care about. It's not something that students care that much about, or they would already know it. They've done so many years of English, they would already be good at this if they really cared about it. So we have to force them to care about it, but they don't inherently care about it. And again, this is something that matters for active learning. Active learning works when you're doing it on a subject that the students care about inherently, that you don't have to justify. If you have to justify, then it's probably going to work. And so for grammar, it doesn't work very well. What else does it not work? Why else doesn't work? It doesn't work because active learning is all about partial success. If you do a vocabulary list and a student knows one third of the words and the other student knows the other third of the words and the other student knows a third of the words and they're five in a team, they're going to get to basically all of the words eventually by working together because they all have partial success and partial success is good. On a vocabulary list, partial success is very good. I've got a vocabulary list that has trees on it, the fir and the oak and the birch, etc. And and so when students are doing this, somebody says, "Oh, arbuste is that oak?" And no, no, arbuste is a tree. And then, oh, is it a sapin? No, 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 it's a tree with leaves. I'm not sure which one it is, but it's a tree with leaves. And so partial understanding of the word helps, is a good thing. When they are doing grammar, when they're learning negatives, first of all of our students can already do negatives that we understand. They can all say, "I not like coffee." And we understand that. We understand what they mean when they say, "I not like coffee." It's not proper English, but we understand what they mean. Now, what we want them to say is, "I don't like coffee," instead of "I not like coffee." But what if they do something else instead? What if they say, like, "I am not like coffee," or I did not like coffee, or "I was not like coffee"? What if they change what they do, but not to what we want? Is that partial success? Nobody would say that it is. This is just another way of failing. And so there is no partial success for the kind of grammar that we teach in English 101, 102, etc. There's only like different ways of failing. And so active learning does not work well for that. So before you do active learning, think about what you're teaching. Is this something that students are going to care about instinctively? Is it possible to have partial success? And if the answer to these questions are no, maybe this is not a subject where you should be using active learning. Next, I have a course that I teach, which is called Introduction to English Civilization. And part of this course, what I wanted to do, I wanted my students to know their artistic periods for architecture and visual arts, because they're language students. They want to travel. I want them to walk in a museum and see that there's a room on the Dutch Golden Age and say, "Oh, well, I really like that. I want to see that. Let's go see that." Or I wanted them to, because you travel in Europe, you walk into so many churches. I wanted them to walk in a church and like, oh yeah, this is Gothic. Okay, yeah, I really like Gothic. So just to have those kind of, and I also want them to know that the Middle Ages is before the Renaissance and that this is before the 17th century, that kind of thing, which they don't when they start the year with me. This is only part of the course. The other part of the course is really knowing the periods, but part of the course is knowing these styles. So you've got the list here for the final review of all the styles they were supposed to, know for the final exam. You've got medieval painting, Italian Renaissance painting, Baroque painting from the Dutch Golden Age, Rococo, Grand Style, Realism, etc. Um, so how do I teach this? How do I evaluate this? Do I do passive learning? Do I do active learning? Um, can I do active learning? And I already knew that for this, I was going to stand in front of the class and give lectures for part of the course. But is there anything I can do that would be active learning? And I decided that, yeah, there was. What if, so the traditional passive way of evaluating this, for example, would be to say, okay, so we saw a medieval painting. Describe to me what the three different criteria of medieval painting are. Like, describe to me what a medieval painting looks like. That would be really passive and kind of not very interesting. So I wanted them to put them in a situation that I described, where they're traveling, they enter a church, and do they know what kind of church it is? So what I did, instead of asking them to repeat the criteria and describe, etc., is I decided I would give them in exams, I would give them this: a sheet printed, full size, in color, beautiful. And let's say in the quiz there's 5 or 10 or 25 of those. They're in a little booklet, something a very beautiful tactile experience where they see a building and they have to tell me what style it is. Is this Gothic? Is this neoclassical? Well, what is this? And I put a little map there. It's in Greater London. I use British architecture everywhere I can for all the styles that they exist in Britain. And I put a little map. And does the map help to answer the question? No. But hopefully, they're trying to learn about English civilization in Britain, and hopefully this is interesting to them. We also have visual arts. So when we have visual arts, I give them a painting like this, and I write the title of the painting. I don't write who did it, although sometimes you can see a signature on the painting, which I don't try to obscure in any way. And then they have to tell me what style this is. Is this Impressionism? Is it British landscape? Is it Rococo? Is it Baroque? Whatever. And then I thought, okay, what else can I do with this? Well, we could do, as an activity, I thought we could do the pre-quiz review. Now, my quiz is one period of 50 minutes, and they don't need the full period. It's about 30 minutes, and they get a lot of those sheets handed to them. I thought, and my class is 2 periods in a row, right? So I thought, let's do the quiz in the second period, and in the first period, just before the quiz, that's when we will do the review, which sounds scary to most teachers and students. You don't do the review the day of the quiz because it's kind of like cheating. They're supposed to study at home, not just come to the review and then pass the quiz. Also, because what if a student doesn't understand? How are they going to readjust? They're not going to have time to readjust um, before the quiz. And I decided that this didn't matter because what matters to me is my students learning. And so the review is part of a process where they are learning. Whether they learn with me in the review or at home, that matters less to me than whether or not they actually learn. And then I decided, you know what, the quiz is also part of a process because the quiz leads to the final exam. So the quiz is a learning activity. So they study at home, they arrive, they have a review, then the next hour it's out. So team activities. I give them like 25 sheets with buildings and paintings. They have the list of what styles it can belong to. And it's really identical to the exam, except it's not the same paintings and the same buildings, but it's the same categories. And it almost feels like cheating in a way because you're really doing exactly what you're going to be doing in the next hour. And I don't give answers. I only question them. If they ask me, is this Gothic? I tell them, I don't know. Is it? and then I try to guide them to the answer without telling them what it is. So I asked them why it would be Gothic. If they could show me, so what else could it be? Well, that's one question I really like asking. What else could it be? Oh, could it be Romanesque? Okay. What is the difference between Gothic and Romanesque? And if they don't remember, I ask them to take out their notes. Take out your notes from when we saw the Gothic and the Romanesque. What is the difference between Gothic and Romanesque? And other things I might do is I might tell them, go on Google Images, write Gothic architecture. And okay, does this look like that? So when we look at the building, let's say this building, if they tell me it's Gothic, all right, open Gothic architecture in Google Images, compare that to that. Does it look the same? No? Oh, okay, but maybe it's not Gothic. What else could it be? So I'm not telling them what the answer is. And they very soon figure out that asking me any question is kind of an exercise in futility and it is going to be very painful. They're not going to get an answer within 2 minutes, that's for sure. In 5 minutes, sure. Eventually, when they've got 90% of the answer, I'll tell them good, yes. And there's this also element that you forgot to mention, but it is important. But it takes a while. So they only ask me when they're really not sure, which is good because they learn to build certainty on their own. So does this work? Oh, where is it? Yeah, active learning is a method. How to not answer questions. This is what I was just explaining. Does this work? Yes, it works so well. This is so good. The pre-quiz review. If the content of your quiz matters to their overall comprehension of the subject matter of your course, and it should. And your quiz is like one period, it's a fairly or half a period. The period before the quiz, doing a review that is basically exactly the quiz is amazing. It doesn't matter that they don't have time to come see you at your office to ask you questions because they won't. And it doesn't matter that it feels like cheating because they learn so much. There is so much energy in the classroom when they're just before the quiz. It doesn't matter that the quiz is worth only 5%, it's worth something, and they care about that. So, how do I know it works? Well, I had very motivated students. Everybody was doing the activity. Nobody was just like, yeah, I don't care about this. No, everybody was doing the activity and really trying to get the answers. So, very engaged. Um, Interestingly, one criticism that because I evaluated my class, right? I did a course evaluation, and one criticism that I got, and it was one of the main criticisms, was that my class was too easy. And I was really annoyed at this first. I was disappointed because I don't want my class to be easy. I want to give them a challenge. I want them to be intellectually motivated, that kind of thing. So I was kind of sad about this. And then that bothered me for a few days, and then I remembered what I teach, and that I teach this. This is not all of my course, it's about 50% of my course. But I teach 25 visual arts and architecture styles. And they learn this in one session, and they're pre-university students. And they tell me that this is easy? Wow, that's impressive because I did not know this when I was 17 years old. I did not know the difference between Baroque and realism and post-impressionism and impression. Like I did not know these distinctions, and most adults don't. So the fact that they're telling me that this is easy, I decided not to take as criticism, but instead to take as a sign that the way I was teaching it works really, really well. Because if you can make all of that content seem easy, then you're doing something right. So, what are the lessons learned from this? First of all, content matters. Having really good images, having nice sheets, having a interesting visual experience, having them be British buildings, having the little map, all of this matters. All those little details matter. And points matter. We're just before the quiz. What else matters? Make it a difficult task. We already talked about this when we saw the principles of active learning. But uh, taking what you want to teach and making it into a task, as opposed to just asking them what are the characteristics of Romanesque, instead of showing them buildings, like okay, what is that? That then it becomes a task and hopefully a difficult task. This is how you'll have engaged students, right? The brain and all that work. And you need to whatever it is you're teaching, it needs to become a difficult task before it is active learning. Lesson number 7, active learning takes time. Anytime they ask me a question, I know it's going to take 5 minutes before I answer. So, if I don't have time to not answer questions, I can't not answer questions. I have to answer the question instead. Answering a question takes 10 seconds. Not answering a question takes 5 minutes. So if you don't have time to do an activity, you don't have time to do it in the active way. Uh, you have to go passive, and it takes your time. You saw the sheets that I made for the building. There were several pictures, the exterior, the interior, lots of details. Um, I'm teaching 25 styles. They're used in quizzes. There's a practice before every quiz, and I want to use different images. Then they're seen in the final exam, and I want different images there as well. And there's a practice before the final exam, and I want different images and buildings there as well. Not the same, never the same. So I made at least 10 slides for each style, which means in one session I made like 300 of those sheets. This took hundreds of hours. It's extremely time consuming. When you want a lot of content and you want that content to be good and interesting and motivating, yes, it takes a ton of your time. Don't do active learning if you don't have time to invest in the course. And what you should do because of that is not decide that when you want to do active learning, you shouldn't say, okay, my whole course is going to be active learning. No, no, just do one activity in the active learning, see how well that works, and don't do the whole course right away. Do more next year. Next lesson, timeliness is impactful. They have, right before a quiz, there's the pressure of the last minute. This is the last chance to get it before they're quizzed on it. And if they don't get it, they're going to have a bad result. They don't want that. And they can't delay. They can't say, yeah, I don't want to do this today. I'll do it the night before. We're the moment before. It's in 30 minutes. The quiz is in 30 minutes. There's no time left. And when you're right before a quiz, there's this energy that is unlike any other energy. And we mostly throw it away as teachers. We mostly don't use that because we feel like it's cheating, that they're supposed to study at home, etc. But all of this energy, it's just so wasteful to not use it. So try, if you can, to add that to your pedagogical approach, that just before the quiz, they have the will, the desire, the drive. Try to use it. Number 9, student population matters. My students doing English Civ are not one-on-one students. They care about getting this content. They care about these 25 styles. They care about my class. They care about all of this. The exact same content with one-on-one level students. They might just, I did come here to study architecture, and they might just not care and not care that they're going to get a bad result. So if you've got the cast of the Breakfast Club as your students, perhaps this specific activity that I did doesn't work very well. Next activity, predictable quizzes. I sort of tried this in an ad hoc manner. In my first quiz, we had seen 4 periods: the early Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the 17th century. And one of my goals with my course, I really wanted my students to know what the Middle Ages are, when they are, what the Renaissance is, when it is, like what order these periods are in, and kind of what centuries they're in, so that they leave my class and they kind of know that's the major periods of Western history. And so on the first quiz, I decided, okay, I'm going to ask them, what periods did we see? Like, what is the first period, second period, third period? What are the centuries? I didn't ask them for specific dates. Just wanted, like, what centuries? Approximate centuries. They were off by 50 years. I didn't care. Like, just really basic when it happens. And 2 other questions. I think, like, name one British ruler. No, that was it. Yeah. Century, the period, what it's called, the centuries, and one important British ruler. I think that was it. And then we got to the next quiz, and the next quiz was on the 18th century. And I was like, do I ask this question again? I thought, you know what? Let's ask it again. Because this matters. I want them to know when the 18th century is. As silly as that sounds, I want them to know when it is. And then we got to the 19th century. Like, do I do this again? Like, yes. They're expecting me to do it. And so if I continue doing it, they're going to expect me to continue to do this. And they're going to learn their periods. They're going to say, oh, he's always asking this. That's like cheating. I can learn the period, and I'm going to get like 10% of the exam right away because I know my period. And this is good. This is what I want. I want them to come to this conclusion that learning the historical periods is good, that for all the historical periods, being able to tell me what century, like I want them to, on their own, realize this. And so that's the idea behind the predictable quizzes. Having your quizzes be kind of identical to the practice, always asking the same questions, having the final exam also be predictable, and just accepting the notion that questions don't have to be hard. Um, they have to be, and the questions, the goal of the question is to encourage them to study what you want them to learn. Knowing their historical periods is not hard, but it's what I want them to learn. So making my quiz really predictable in that sense. Does this work? Yes, it works well. It's a solid activity. And when I teach civilization again, I will do this again. I put a B minus here. I don't think it works for every course. So how well do I know that this works? First of all, my students enjoyed this. They felt it was fair. They really like, oh, that's fair. He's asking always the same questions. They felt that they learned because they got rewarded for knowing this information. Um, so and my students did learn. So at the end of the year, my students knew their historical periods and the centuries associated with, and this is a goal for me. So I'm really happy that they knew all of this. What are the negatives? Well, it requires a lot of quizzes. If you only have like 2 quizzes, they're not going to see the pattern develop. I had 4 quizzes in the final exam, so I had time to develop this pattern. If you're not going to do a lot of quizzes, it doesn't work very well. And do you want a lot of quizzes? Most courses you don't. And it requires motivated students. It worked because my students cared about having a good result. In a mandatory ESL course in English 101, they probably don't care that much about having a good result, and having the repetitive quiz might not work as well. So what are some lessons? Well, evaluation should reward study. This is a really basic teacher lesson, but it's worth mentioning in the context of active learning because it matters also to do active learning. If your evaluations reward study, then that's going to encourage study and they're going to study more. If your evaluations don't reward study, they're not going to. So this is how the repetitive quiz works. It scratches that itch. It makes them want to study the basic things that you want them to learn. This is good. So evaluation should reward study. Next activity, group discussions. This is the canonical active learning idea. Is let's put them in a team. Let's have them discuss it, and that's like the basic idea behind active learning. So I did this with my English civilization students, so motivated students. I had them read at home text on the periods that we're doing. And after reading at home, they came to class, and as a team, they prepared questions on the different sections of the text. They're like, okay, so what are some characteristics of Romanesque architecture if the text talked about Romanesque architecture? What is early modern English? Like that kind of thing. And then they gave me the questions, and I used those questions as quiz questions. I was like, okay, I'm going to use your questions as questions of the quiz. But before I used them as quiz questions, what I did is I chose the best of all the teams I had. I chose the best question for every section, and I put that on a sheet and I gave it back to them. These were the best questions I found, and I'm going to use those as quiz questions. I also did discussions like this after students watched videos. We watched BBC documentaries, and after every documentary that we watched, they had a sheet. They had some listening comprehension questions like what did he mention here, what did he mention there, but also we had discussion questions like, okay, so the video mentioned Tracy Emin. Google Tracy Emin and find out who she is. Did we talk about her in the class? And when they Google her and they arrive on her Wikipedia page, they're going to see that, oh yeah, we did talk about her in the class. And so these discussion questions were meant for them to be able to relate what we saw in the video to what we had seen in class. Because names, Tracy Ammon, you hear that name in my class and then you hear that name in the video, you might make the connection, but most people won't. It was a different week, so they don't remember that I mentioned that. So having them do discussions like this really allowed me to connect the videos with the classroom. I thought these were great ideas. And all of this was quiz material because I would use the comprehension questions for the video and their questions for their readings as quiz material. I put some questions in bold and said, okay, these are the most important questions. The other questions might be on the quiz, but not. And the discussion questions were never on the quiz. They were just like to connect the material. So and they were if you had extra time at the end of activity. So I never put those in the quiz. And again, this is a really canonical example of how you're supposed to do active learning. And so this can be transferred to almost any kind of teaching environment, having students do activities based on, like discussions based on readings or videos. And did this work? Actually, no. I find this really interesting because there's nothing as classical as an example than this. This is the most classical example of active learning that I have done this year, and it was not a success for me. Well, first, so why wasn't it a success? The participation gradually crashed. So the first time I did this activity in the first weeks of class, I had great participation and it worked well. And I thought, wow, this active learning thing works so well. This is great. And as the year went on, participation lowered and lowered and lowered. In what ways? Well, first of all, I had, for the readings, I had people show up who hadn't done the reading. And what they would do is they would wait for their team members to formulate questions. Just let them formulate the questions. Then they would wait for me to choose the best questions for every section. Then they would wait for me to give them back those questions. And then the night before the quiz, they would read the text, but just for the questions and specifically just for the questions in bold. So they only read like a tenth of the text. They only read like the parts that they thought was the most important. The second way that I noticed reduced participation was for the videos. I had many students who came for the videos, and the videos, like BBC documentaries, are about an hour long. So the first period we watched the BBC documentary, and the second period we have the discussions and the discussion questions on the BBC documentary. And what I noticed my students were doing is that some of them would come for the video and then leave during the break and not come back for the discussion. And when I see student behavior like this, like predictable behavior, students being absent for a specific period on a regular basis, I take that as feedback, as course evaluation. This is telling me that the students feel the video is valuable, but feel the discussion on the video is not valuable. So again, these discussions, I had really crashing participation, and which led to lower grades. The students who did these things, who felt it was not valuable for them, got gradually lower and lower grades on the quizzes and the exams and anything that related to the subjects discussed in the videos, either directly or about asking them about the videos or just asking them about the broader issues of the period that was seen in the video. So it got gradually lower grades. So I wasn't happy with this. So where did I go wrong? What lessons can I learn from this? Well, some old lessons. Timeliness, the idea of timeliness. Here we have an example of reverse timeliness. The students don't read the text because they don't need to read the text now. If we had discussions on the text just before the quiz, they would have read the text because that's the last second they have to prepare for the quiz. The fact that we're weeks away from the quiz means they don't have to do it now. They can do it later. They can read it the night before the quiz. Another old lesson that comes back is that evaluations should reward study. And by study here, let's take the example. Let's take a broader view and say that evaluation should reward work. So I have students who worked and who read the text the night before the discussion, or before the discussion, and I had students who read as little as they could and just before the quiz. Now, to them, to my students, they felt that the work that students were doing to prepare for the discussion was not rewarded because I didn't evaluate the discussions. Uh, they gave me questions, I gave them the questions back, and then used that as questions for the quizzes. But the discussion itself, which takes a lot of preparation and work, was not rewarded. And so my students felt it's kind of a waste of time to do all of this work. It's not rewarded. Finally, the old lessons, points matter. If you want to do discussions and the discussions don't count, you should expect that you will lose student motivation. Um, we've created a monster and we need to feed that monster. We can argue all we want with our students, but if the discussions don't count, that's going to matter in the minds of our students. Finally, a new lesson. Laziness is natural. Stop. I can fight with my students and try to convince them to be hardworking. That's going to lead to great things. But laziness is natural. Everybody wants to be lazy and lie around and relax and all that. Nobody wants to do all of this work. And so, if my activity is structured in a way that laziness is not punished, for example, if there's nothing stopping my students from not reading the text, just sitting through the discussion, and then benefiting from the work of others, and just if there's nothing stopping this laziness, then it's going to happen. And so my group discussions didn't start off as a D. They started off as a B plus. They started off great, and then it lowered and lowered and lowered until it reached like a D. And I no longer want to do this the same way. That does not mean that group discussions do not work as an active learning method. Again, they're the canonical, classical example of what active learning is. But this shows you that how you do it matters as much as whether or not it's active learning. It really matters how you do it. So here are my ideas for next year. Next year, I want to do this group discussions again. I want to do it again, but not the same way. So what will be different? Well, first of all, they're going to hand in the results of their discussions, and I'm going to give points to the team. So it's going to be very minuscule in terms of how many points are given. But they're going to get points for their teamwork, and they're going to evaluate themselves and the other team members as team members at the end of the year. Who was good, who wasn't good, who contributed, so that their team result is affected by how much they participated in their team. And this is to respond to the need that students have for effort to be rewarded for things that are difficult to count. Also, the discussion questions that were so interesting but were not quizzed on, I'm going to label them as these are questions to help you prepare for the final exam. So the students have a better idea of why they're doing these discussion questions. During the discussion questions of the videos, like research Tracy Ammon and find out if we talked about her during the class, they're like, well, why do we do this? It's not on the quiz. And they knew it wasn't on the quiz. But if they have this notion of, oh, it helps me understand the period so that I can be better prepared for the final exam, then they'll be more motivated to do it. So I'm going to label these questions as like final exam preparation question, that kind of thing. And that's my plan. I hope it works better. I'm sure it will. Discussions are good. It's just how you do them matters, and I think I can do it better. Next activity, peer criticism. The idea here is instead of me taking your essay and telling you what is good and what is bad about it, you show it to other students in a team, your team, and they tell you if it's good or not good. And we develop this skill, and you tell others if it's good or not good, and we develop this skill until you can pick up an essay and tell me if it's good or bad and all the weak points, etc. And so this is to develop like very high level of mastery of what an English essay is like. We do this in a round table format. The teacher is there, and the teacher goes last in the round table discussion. And that's the idea. Does this work? Yes, it's a solid activity. It's really well. This was done in the language program in the final course of the language program, which we call the integration course, where the students learn to put everything together and do some research. I did this activity 10 years ago when I first taught the course, half the course, the end of the course. And it is an activity that is still done today. Now, an activity that is still done 10 years later, that should tell you something that, yes, it works well. So why does it work well? Well, first of all, it develops very advanced expertise. The students become really good at telling you what a good essay is like. And it's not just bookish. They didn't memorize the definitions of a thesis. Like they can look at a thesis statement and tell you, oh, I like this, I didn't like this, it should be improved here. And the students are motivated. They like doing this in a discussion format. Now, why does it work? What are the lessons? Well, there's a lot of basic principles of active learning here that are recalled, but I do want to say that doing this activity takes a lot of time, and I mean teacher time and class time, because you can't really do this if the teacher is absent. I mean, at the end of the year, the students could do it together, that's fine. But at the beginning of the year, it's not just they don't have the knowledge to do it, they're also too polite to do it. They can't look at one of their colleagues and say, well, your essay sucks. Like, that's not polite. So that's why the teacher has to be there the first time around, and that's why they go last. So the way that it works is first the student who wrote the essay, we read his introduction, and he tells us if it's a good introduction or not. And they all say, yeah, I think it's pretty good. And then you go around the table, and all the students say, yeah, yeah, it's pretty good, it's pretty good, it's pretty good. And then it gets to you. And then you say, well, no, guys, this is not good. So there's a section called background information. It doesn't actually include any background information. It just goes from more general to more specific, and the thesis doesn't take position on the subject. That's not good. You should supposed to know that's not good. Now, and then you go to the next person. Okay, you read your introduction and we'll criticize it. And by the time you get to the second and then the third one, they really don't want to be the one who says, yeah, my introduction is fine, and then who's corrected by the teacher is like, no, that's not fine. So they're really more motivated, more keen to find the mistake in their own introduction before somebody else points it out. And also the keeners, they don't want to say, yeah, it's fine, and then have me correct them and tell them, no, it's not fine. So it's a big wheel that starts grinding where embarrassment becomes a fear, and they want to get it right. So they master those principles, and by the middle, like you do that a few times, and then you don't have to say anymore the thesis is wrong. They know that the thesis is wrong. The person who wrote the thesis can tell you that the thesis is wrong. Um, but to do this, you need to sit with every team for like half an hour for a few times during the year. So that if you have a lot of teams of four, teams of five, it paralyzes the class for a few weeks. Um, so is this a good activity? Yes. Yes, it's a great activity. It's amazing. Does it work for English 101? No, of course not. This is for a very advanced course where they're trying to become really good at writing essays, where that's the goal. If you have essays in your class, but it's really not the main goal of the course, so the main goal of the course is communicating in English, etc., then don't do this. But if it's the main goal of the course, like kind of our integration course is, then sure, this is a wonderful, wonderful activity. So what lesson do we learn from this? The lesson is about how you are as a teacher. And to decide how you are as a teacher, I want you to think, always this question, what would Aragorn do? Aragorn, hero in Lord of the Rings, one of the heroes in Lord of the Rings. His duty is to protect Frodo and to guide Frodo and to take him to Mordor. And eventually Frodo leaves him and goes on to Mordor on his own. And before he leaves, they meet, and you can tell Aragorn doesn't want to let him go alone, but you can tell Frodo decides that's it. I need to do this on my own. And Aragorn famously says, I would have followed you to the end, to the very pits of Mordor. And not I would have led you to the end, not I would have taken you to the end. No, I would have followed you. And this is Aragorn being an active learning teacher. And Frodo does make it to the end, in large part because of how Aragorn had been with him throughout all those adventures prior to that. Aragorn was always the one who follows Frodo, accompanies Frodo, guides Frodo, doesn't tell Frodo what to do, doesn't force Frodo. Frodo decides. Frodo learns on his own, but he's always got Aragorn there to help him out. And I realize this might not make a lot of sense if you haven't seen The Lord of the Rings, but if you one day see The Lord of the Rings, I think you'll realize that this was a very good analogy. And in any case, Aragorn is a guide. He's not the leader. He's a guide. And if you want to become an active learning teacher, you need to become a guide. And as a final lesson, always evaluate what you're doing. Look at your students. Do they seem motivated? Do they seem interested? Are their results good? Do they come to that period where you do the discussion? Do they come to that other period where you do your lab? And take all of that as positive, constructive criticism of what works, what doesn't work. This is a general teaching principle of always evaluating what you're doing with a very open mind, very accepting of criticism. But if you're going to do active learning, it's very important. Why? Because them being engaged is the whole entire point. If you're doing an activity and in theory it's great, but they don't care and they don't participate, forget the theory, it doesn't work. As a review, Here's what we saw today. My activities, we had the vocabulary list, which got a B, the essay by deduction, which got an A question mark, A for me, not an A for other people. We got the scaffolded grammar, which really doesn't work in my opinion. If it works for you, wonderful. Doesn't seem to work for me. The pre-quiz review, which is an A+, everybody should be doing this. Predictable quizzes, which is interesting if you've got a lot of quizzes. Group discussions, which didn't work for me, so be really careful about how you do group discussions. The how really matters. And peer criticism, which is great if you're trying to develop very advanced expertise. My lessons, stop answering questions. Stop giving the answers, etc. And learn how to do this. Do it gradually, but you're going to see it's very satisfying when students get to the answer without you having told them, and they even get to the certainty that they have the right answer. This is one of the best goals of teaching. So learn to do this even if you're not doing active learning. Learning to stop answering questions is a wonderful tip. This is the main tip for today's lesson. Lesson number 2 is good content really matters, so have fun, engaging activities. To do active learning, it's essential. Lesson number 3, points are still king. The basics of teaching don't change when you do active learning. Basics of teaching and evaluating do not change. So you can't just suddenly forget that your things need to be evaluated for the students to care. Lesson number 4, create like difficult tasks. This is what often makes your activity interesting, is it's a task and it's difficult. Lesson number 5 was partial success has to matter. If you have something where it's all or nothing, if you have something to teach them and it's all or nothing and there's no partial success, don't do it actively. It's not interesting. Lesson number 6 is that active teaching is not for all teachers. Some teachers will enjoy it more than others, and even some activities will work better for some than for others. Lesson number 7, plan for lots of time, and I mean class time, but I mean also your time. You need a lot of class time to do active learning. It doesn't mean that students are learning less because they're learning faster, but you need lots of time. Lesson number 8, timeliness rocks. Even if you're not doing active learning, think of this time just before evaluations as very precious time where the students will be engaged and interested and use that time. Lesson number 9 is some students are not going to like active learning, and you should think of your student groups and is this specific activity, are they going to like it? If they're not, then it's not going to work. Number 10, evaluating predictably is actually a really good tip. It makes students realize on their own what matters and what doesn't matter without you having to tell them. And that's always more effective. They're going to enjoy it more. It's going to feel like cheating to them, so they're going to do it more. It's good. Lesson 11, plan for laziness. Don't criticize laziness. Just if your activity encourages laziness, change it so that it doesn't. And finally, become a guide. Become a guide is the same tip as tip number 1 about stop answering questions. They go together hand in hand. But this is the way to stop answering questions, not by not helping the person to grow, but by helping him or her to grow in a different way. And the final tip was evaluate everything you're doing. Be really open to criticism. Direct when the students tell you, also indirect when they're just not participating. Take that as criticism that this activity doesn't work. And that's it for today. If you have any questions or comments, this is my name and this is my email address. Don't hesitate to write. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day.